Welcome to the examination of a game that Siegbert Tarrasch considered one of his best. In this game you'll witness a spectacular battle between bishops and knights, alongside the most effective strategy to exploit the advantage of two bishops, namely pushing pawns forward over the entire board to gradually restrict the knights and squeeze the enemy forces until they are completely paralyzed. And once the enemy knights are immobilized, the decisive breakthrough follows. Join me as we analyze this remarkable game and uncover the powerful strategy that you can also use to dominate with two bishops in your own games. White starts with e4, Tarrasch plays e5, White plays the Spanish game, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and Tarrasch opts for the Berlin defense, knight f6, attacking the e4 pawn. White leaves the pawn under attack and castles. Tarrasch captures on e4, but of course he won't be able to hold this pawn because his king is still in the center. The main line for White in this position is d4. Or another popular move is rook e1. In our game, however, White plays queen e2, which is also playable, attacking the knight, so the knight must retreat. Now it would be premature to capture the pawn right away, because in this case, as the knight has survived, it would jump on d4, attacking the queen, the bishop and the c2 pawn. For this reason, first White must give up his bishop, so only after exchanging on c6, White can capture on e5. Check. So, Black has the advantage of two bishops, but his pawn structure is damaged, he has doubled pawns on the c-file. Now, in case Black plays bishop e7, his g7 pawn would fall. In case he plays bishop e6, White can play knight d4, attacking the pinned bishop and capturing it. Next move, depriving Black of his advantage of two bishops, and Black would be forced to capture with a pawn, so besides the doubled pawns, he would also have an isolated pawn on e6. So the only move for Black in this position is queen e7. The queen, however, stands in the bishop's way. For this reason, it would be better for White to avoid the exchange of the queens and move away his queen, let's say to a5. Of course, Black has the advantage of two bishops, but it will take some time to finish the development of the king side. Besides that, he has the doubled pawns, so the position would remain more or less equal. Instead of moving his queen away, White plays rook e1, however. And this lets Tarrasch exchange the queens, after which he gets a slight advantage. Rook takes e5, check. Of course, if Black plays bishop e6, White would still play knight d4, followed by knight takes e6, depriving Black from the two bishops advantage, so, of course, Tarrasch plays bishop e7. It might seem that Black still has problems in finishing the development, as his bishop is pinned. For this reason he cannot castle, for example, but Tarrasch easily solves this problem. After White plays d3, Tarrasch plays f6, attacking the rook, kicking it out, so with the tempo he vacates the f7 square for his king. After the rook retreats, king f7 follows, and it turns out that Tarrasch has solved the problems with the development, and the only remaining problem is the doubled pawns. And his king is actually better placed than the enemy king, because the queens and a pair of minor pieces have been exchanged, and the game is heading towards the endgame, and in the endgame the king is better placed closer to the center, of course. White plays bishop f4, and now Tarrasch begins to execute the most effective strategy in these kind of positions. When you have the two bishops advantage in positions that are neither closed nor completely open, as in this one, the best approach is to push pawns forward to restrict the enemy pieces and gradually squeeze your opponent. This method was created by Wilhelm Steinitz, and Tarrasch in this game executes it in a spectacular way. So he starts the expansion on the king side first, g5, with a tempo, attacking the bishop and depriving the white pieces of the f4 square, and also forcing the bishop to make a decision on which diagonal to stay, on this diagonal or on this diagonal. Of course, in case white captures the knight, black would solve his only problem, undoubling his pawns and getting the positions with two bishops against the two knights. So, of course, that would be in black's favor. In case the bishop retreats to g3, it would lose contact with the queen side. Besides that, black might exchange his knight for this bishop by playing knight f5. Not right away, of course, in this case the bishop would capture on c7, so black might play bishop d7 followed by rook c8, defending the c7 pawn, and then knight f5 followed by knight takes g3. For example, that's one of the possible ways to continue for black in this case. For this reason, instead of bishop g3, the bishop retreats to d2. Now Tarrasch develops his light-squared bishop and creates an immediate threat of bishop takes f3, and after g takes f in this case, the white's pawn structure on the king side would be completely destroyed. For this reason, the knight moves to d4. But now Tarrasch moves another pawn, depriving white of another square, the central square this time, with a tempo. In case the knight retreats to b3, black can play c4, attacking the knight and the pawn and getting rid of his doubled pawn. So, for this reason, the knight retreats to e2. Now Tarrasch makes another strong move, knight b5, creating an immediate threat of bishop takes e2, and after rook takes e2, knight d4 with a double attack, attacking the rook, and also, in case the rook retreats, the c2 pawn, after which the a1 rook might fall. For this reason, white must do something about this threat, the threat of the invasion of the black knight on d4. In case he prevents it in the most natural way by playing c3, of course his d3 pawn would turn into a backward pawn and black would immediately attack it, and it isn't clear how white is going to hold this pawn. For this reason, the only way to prevent this threat is bishop c3. At first sight, black should immediately exchange his knight for the bishop and get the two bishops against the two knights. However, in this case, black would still have the doubled pawns, and his advantage would be only slight. Tarrasch found a better way to continue. His knight will invade the d4 square, and of course this knight will be the greatest piece on the board and it will be intolerable. So white would be forced to exchange his bishop for the knight himself, after which black will capture with a pawn and undouble his pawns. But the knight cannot invade right away, because white knight together with the bishop control this square, so first Tarrasch plays rook d8. And only after white develops his queen's knight, the knight invades, threatening to win a piece, to capture on e2, and also attacking c2, so white must eliminate this knight. He cannot exchange his knight for the black knight. In this case, after c takes d, it turns out that the bishop is trapped. The only square it can move is a5, but after b6 it would be lost. So white must exchange his bishop for the knight. Bishop takes d4, c takes d, and black gets the position with two bishops against the two knights, and he has undoubled his pawns, and his d4 pawn is very strong. It restricts white. For example, the knight cannot move to c3. Neither can it jump on d4, nor can it move to f4. So the only square for the knight, remaining square, is g3. Black is threatening bishop b4, which might be quite unpleasant, pinning the knight and attacking it. So white first prevents it by playing a3. Now Tarrasch expands on the queen side, c5, reinforcing the important central pawn and also preparing the breakthrough, the c4 breakthrough, which will come with great effect later in the game. So the only square for this knight is g3, so it jumps on g3, and from g3 the knight would love to occupy the e4 square. These two squares, e4 and c4, are the most important ones. White knights would love to occupy these squares because it's defended, supported by the pawn. On the other squares, black pieces can attack the knights and the knights would be forced to retreat, but on these squares they would be defended. However, black can always kick these pieces out by pushing, in case the knight is on c4, the b pawn, in case it's on e4, the f 5 pawn. And Tarrasch isn't even going to wait for his opponent to occupy these squares with his knights. He is going to push the pawns anyways in order to restrict them, the knights, even more. But first he pushes the side pawn. Now he might play h4 at any moment, kicking out the knight from g3. f3 followed, the bishop must retreat. So the knights don't have any squares to move. In case the knight moves to c4, b5 would follow. If the knight moves to e4, f5 would follow, and the knight must retreat to a passive square. So the only thing left for white is trying to play with the rooks. So he plays rook e2, vacating the e1 square. For the second rook, trying to double the rooks and create some active play. However, as Tarrasch writes in his annotations, although white rooks will occupy the only open file, the rooks will not be effectively placed because they wouldn't have any squares of invasion. All the squares the rooks might possibly invade are controlled by black. But white doesn't have any other option, so he will double on this file. And Tarrasch continues his expansion on the queen side. b5, taking under control this square, restricting the knight even more, and preparing the c4 breakthrough in the right time. White doubles and creates an immediate threat. The bishop is under attack. Tarrasch writes that he didn't want to defend attacking the bishop. Tarrasch writes that he didn't want to defend the bishop by playing rook e8, because in this case, sooner or later, the bishop will move away from this square, and that would lead to the exchange of the rooks, and the exchange, of course, would be in white's favor, because he is cramped, and when you are cramped, each exchange brings you some relief. For this reason, Tarrasch didn't defend the bishop. Neither did he make the most natural-looking move, bishop d6. In this case, white can play knight e4 with a tempo. For this reason, Tarrasch retreats his bishop to f8, which might look a little bit passive, but as white doesn't have any active counterplay anyways, black can afford to make a passive move. So the knight invades the e4 square. Black cannot kick it out right away by playing f5, because now that the bishop has left the e7 square and it will not defend the g5 pawn, in case black plays f5, the knight would simply capture it. So Tarrasch first plays rook g8, defending the pawn and preparing the f5 advance. But white plays knight b3, attacking the c5 pawn for the second time. So first Tarrasch must defend this pawn. And now it turns out that there is nothing white can do to prevent f5, so without waiting for his opponent to kick the knight out, white retreats the knight in advance, knight d2. So the most logical way to continue for black is f5, of course, in order to take under control the most important square and completely restrict the white knights. But Tarrasch writes that he didn't want to let the white rook invade e5. In case he plays f5, of course, the white rook would invade e5. That's why he plays bishop d6 first, taking under control this square. But white knight returns to e4, attacking the bishop. That's why the bishop must return to f8 and the knight returns to d2. White, of course, would love to repeat the position and agree to a draw. But Tarrasch, of course, is playing for the victory. So he plays f5 anyways, completely restricting the white knights, but letting the white rook invade e5. So at least now white has one active piece. However, by playing rook e5, white hasn't created an immediate threat. And here Tarrasch made a mistake. He played bishop d6, which looks like the most natural move. White, however, didn't exploit this mistake and in his turn also makes a mistake. He retreats to e2 and again gets a terrible cramped position. Instead of retreating to e2, white could have played rook d5, attacking the bishop. and the bishop cannot retreat because the d7 bishop would fall in this case. Tarrasch just briefly mentions in his annotations that in this case, in case white played rook d5, he could have played rook g6, defending the bishop, and it turns out that the white rook would be almost trapped. It doesn't have a single square to move. However, both Tarrasch and his opponent, and also Aaron Nimzovich, who also annotated this game in his classic work, My System, missed the hidden resource white had. So now you can pause the video and try to find this move and the idea how white can activate his terribly restricted knights and create a very good counterplay, getting even a better position. So, in order to activate his knights, a white knight must occupy one of these squares. In order to do it, he must deflect the pawns which defend these squares. In case he tries to deflect the b5 pawn by playing a4, black can play a6, defending the pawn. And in case white captures on b5, the black a6 pawn would replace the b pawn on this square. But in case white tries to deflect this pawn, the black g-pawn cannot defend it anymore. So that was the move, the great move, g4. Threatening to capture on f5 with a tempo, attacking the rook, because the pawn on f5 would be defended by the rook. And after the disappearance of this pawn, the e4 square will be available for the white knight. And what can black do? In case he captures, white would recapture and still would have the same threat. And in case black accepts the pawn sacrifice and captures on g4, the knight would invade with great effect. Attacking the bishop for the second time, white is threatening simply to capture and win a piece. Besides that, attacking the c5 pawn for the third time. And the bishop cannot retreat because the d7 bishop would fall. The only move black has would be rook c6 in this case, but of course knight takes c5 would follow, white would get back his sacrificed pawn, and this time the white knights would dominate the black bishops. So both bishops would be under attack in this case. So black would lose one of his bishops anyways and would stay with a bad bishop against white's great knight. For example, if he moves his attacked bishop to c8, white would simply capture on d6, and after rook takes d6, rook e5, white rooks dominate the e-file, the rook is threatening to invade the 7th rank, and the knight is greatly placed on the dark square, so black cannot exchange his light squared bishop for this knight. His bishop is bad, it's restricted by its own pawn, while white can always reinforce his knight, so the knight will stay on this square forever, and white would be much better. Or, in case, instead of retreating the attacked bishop, black captures on c5, then of course the d7 bishop would fall with a check. So again, the rook would be very active, while the black rooks aren't so active, and white would have a great centralized knight on e4. Again, the knight would be immortal because black cannot exchange his dark squared bishop for this knight. So in both cases, of course, white would be much better. But of course, it wasn't easy to see this opportunity. So instead of rook d5, white played rook e2. But what should have Tarrasch done instead of bishop d6 in this position? Now that we know that white would get a great counterplay with g4, now we can see Tarrasch's best possible move, g4, preventing white from playing g4, and only then kicking out the rook. So after that, after bishop d6, rook d5, white won't have the opportunity to play g4 anymore and black would be better. But both players missed it, and after bishop d6, instead of rook d5, the rook retreats to e2, and again white gets a terrible position and Tarrasch continues his deadly squeeze. He wants to play c4, of course. That's his main idea, main breakthrough. But he cannot do it right away because of the knight. The knight in this case would capture on d4. That's why he needs to kick the knight out. In order to do it, he needs to push the a-pawn forward. For this reason, at the moment, of course, he cannot play a5 because the knight would simply capture it. For this reason, he plays rook a8, preparing a5. In case the pawn moves to a4 and kicks the knight out, white would be completely paralyzed. So white prevents it by playing knight a5 and creating his own threat, knight b7, attacking the bishop, and the white knight would suddenly become active. Tarrasch, of course, doesn't allow this to happen. He plays rook b8, taking under control the b7 square. And the knight retreats to b3, and Tarrasch understands that it's early to think about a5 advance. So he returns to the king side, h4. So the knights are completely restricted. There are no squares they can move. The rooks don't have any squares to invade because all these squares are controlled by the black bishops. So the only thing left for white is to make waiting moves. So he plays king h1. So how should Tarrasch now improve his position and increase the pressure? He wants to play bishop e6 in order to close the e-file for the rooks and also take under control the important c4 square. And after the e-file would be closed, his bishop, dark squared bishop, would be free to move, because at the moment it cannot move as it must keep an eye on the e7 square. But white cannot move his bishop to e6 right away because white would simply capture it. That's why Tarrasch plays rook g6. And he will play, of course, bishop e6 next move. White again makes a waiting move and bishop e6. Now the dark squared bishop is free to move. And again white makes a waiting move, rook f2, and Tarrasch one more time tries to push the a-pawn forward. So he again tries rook a8. And it turns out that now that the bishop is on e6, in case white again plays knight a5 in order to prevent the a-pawn from moving forward, this time instead of rook b8, which prevented the invasion of the knight on b7, black has a stronger move, bishop d5, again preventing the white knight from invading b7, completely restricting it, and creating his own threats. So white is completely paralyzed, while black might play bishop f4, for example, threatening bishop e3, or he can play g4, creating some attack, even attack on the white king. So in this case, of course, black would be much better. So instead of this, instead of knight a5, white plays rook e2. And now, of course, Tarrasch pushes the a-pawn forward. In the anticipation of a4, white plays knight b1, vacating the d2 square for the second knight. And after a4, the knight moves to d2. So white knights are almost completely paralyzed now. And now that the knight has left the b3 square and it cannot capture on d4, now it's time to break through. c4. So in case white captures on c4, after b takes c, the b file would open and the b2 pawn would fall. So black would simply play rook b8 next move. For this reason, after c4, the knight retreats to f1, taking under control the e3 square, probably to prevent the possible invasion of the bishop. And now that the rook has completed its mission on the a file, the a-pawn has advanced to a4, it returns to the c file, increasing the pressure on this file. King h1, white still makes waiting moves, and c3 to completely paralyze. So now the knights don't have any moves. So all these squares the knights might possibly jump to are controlled by black. And black is also threatening to capture on b2. That's why white captures himself. And after d takes c, finally the knight gets one square to move. So the knight immediately occupies this square. Tarrasch pushes the pawn forward, threatening to capture on a3. The pawn on a3 would be defended by the bishop, followed by a2, and that would be the end. To prevent this, of course, in case white captures on b4, Tarrasch would simply capture and still play a3, a2. For this reason, after b4, white plays knight c4, defending the a3 pawn for the second time. But one of the advantages of having two bishops is that you can always exchange one of them for the opponent's best piece, and it's time to do it. The best piece is the knight, so Tarrasch exchanges his bishop for the knight, and after d takes c, it turns out that the remaining knight is completely paralyzed, it cannot move anywhere, and Tarrasch simply captures on c4, the rooks cannot invade either, and he is threatening simply to capture on a3 again, followed by a2. In case white captures, again he would simply capture and again push the pawn forward. For this reason, white plays rook e3, attacking the c3 pawn. And after Tarrasch captures on a3, white captures the pawn. Finally, his knight is brought into play, but bishop b4, and immediately the knight, it turns out that the knight would be lost as it's pinned, it cannot move, and next move, black would simply capture it. For this reason, in this position, white resigned. And now I recommend watching Capablanca's positional masterpiece, where he executed one of his greatest squeezes over the entire board. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.